Hello, everyone, and welcome. We thank you all for joining us in this tough time. We are gathered here today to remember our good friend, Google Analytics, who many of us came to know simply as GA. Today will comprise of a few parts. First, we'll give the opportunity to mourn, which we all know is so deeply needed in this time. Then, we'll spend a few moments remembering the good times with GA and look back fondly on some of our favorite times together. From there, we'll give opportunities for moving on, as although it is scary without GA, life does continue, and we found ways to honor the memory of GA with our future analytics. The transition to GA4 happened first very slowly, then very fast. In some ways, it's felt like a lifetime with GA, and in other ways, it feels like just yesterday we were looking at our conversions, e-commerce overview screens, and feeling like we had a really good handle on traffic and conversion sources from our various e-com channels. The new reality is vague and gray. What was once a cornerstone of our analytics stack is now a shell of its former self and leaves us reeling for more. For today, we're going to give space to remember the life of our friend GA and share some of our favorite memories and compare them to the new reality of GA's successor, GA4. From there, our colleague, Ian Jordan, who we'll introduce shortly, is going to help us move forward to how we can best honor GA in the future of analytics. Before we dive into it, we wanted to take a moment to introduce ourselves. My name is Chris Davis, a solutions architect here with Tadpole, and I've known GA personally for over 8 years. Like many of you, it was something I grew to love and rely on to help guide clients' decision-making and strategy. My colleague Ian, who you'll meet momentarily, has well over a decade of experience working with GA, both on the merchant and agency side. He's also integrated GA4 more times than he cares to recall by this point. To honor GA's life, we put together a quick video for us all to watch together. Before I pass it over to Ian for more ways to move on, I wanted to take a moment to share some quick horror stories we've seen with GA4 implementations. One of the most common of which is missing users in sessions. With driving traffic being the first stage in the customer journey funnel, missing users in sessions have huge impacts. This leads to inaccurate conversion rates and not knowing where to invest dollars and efforts from an e-commerce channel perspective to drive the most qualified traffic to our website. Others we commonly see are page views and conversions being counted twice. Many times this happens with streaming in old GA events in parallel with new GA4 events and leads to conversion rates well overreported and average order value well underreported. In terms of page views, this leads to all sorts of problems with engagement data, in particular bounce rate, which Ian will cover here coming up. Last, before I turn it over to Ian, we wanted to share some common pain points of areas of GA that we used to rely on that we can't anymore. Starting with filtered views, which for many of us were the cornerstones of the analyses we used to run. Beyond that, the lack of export functionality makes the data sets much less manipulatable and agile for all the different use cases we used to rely on GA for. Lastly, the lack of real-time reporting and limited look-back windows has made analysis feel vague and cloudy without knowing what's happening most recently on the website. Waiting multiple days for conversion data from page channels to populate is a recipe for disaster that we want to avoid, if at all possible. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Ian Jordan, who's going to help us further unpack and move forward.
Want to first thank Chris for remembering the good times and thinking about all of the amazing reports and analyses we were able to generate with Google Analytics 3. We really missed those days here, and thank you all for joining, and just to remember the great views and reports that we could pull out and insights we could pull out of Google Analytics 3. So now, in kind of a little bit of a turn, we'd like to sort of point the finger at maybe what was the demise of Google Analytics 3. So, unfortunately, we did have Google Analytics 4 roll out, and so I wanted to talk to you today maybe about some of the issues around Google Analytics 4, things to look out for as you're implementing it and kind of traversing the different data sets. So we can look here. The first one being bounce rate. We see pretty consistently that people are seeing these different issues around bounce rate between Google Analytics 3 and Google Analytics 4. And, kind of what it comes down to are these definitions, right? So Google Analytics 3, pretty straightforward. The bounce rate was defined as just the percentage of single page sessions and really where the user left the site from that entrance page without taking an interaction, a click, a deep scroll, submitting a form, things like that. It gets a little more complicated here with Google Analytics 4, though, where the bounce rate is really just the subtraction of engagement rate from 100%. So if your engagement rate was 60%, your bounce rate would be 40%. But there's some nuances that go into that and how that engagement rate is calculated. So we look at this as the number of sessions with 2 or more pages, the user spent 10 or more seconds on the page, and then maybe the user triggered a conversion or key event. So there's a little bit of just nuance to that, and maybe even some confusion around how you set those up. It's not as straightforward as it was in Google Analytics 3. And so what we've seen a lot of times is that bounce rate just hit a cliff in maybe either direction, and how that changes based off of the implementation. And so next, I think the other main difference here is we see events as kind of the primary source of measurement in Google Analytics 4. So universal analytics, really straightforward, right? It was well defined. We had page views, and then you had maybe some attributes and other events that went along with those page views. But in GA4, it gets a little more complicated. And just one example we could look at here is a purchase event. So instead of passing over a purchase on its own, you have to pass over all the products, not just the revenue, and then it sums the revenue from those products. You need the currency, you need the transaction ID, more item details. So, UA or GA3 was really straightforward. allowed for a quicker implementation, maybe less ambiguity around how you would implement that. And then if we look further beyond just the transaction ID or the transaction and purchase events, we can look at things like add to cart, begin checkout, shipping step completions, and all of those require pretty specific schema to be passed in to Google Analytics 4 for it to register and register accurately. So if those aren't implemented, your funnels might break down. If they're not implemented accurately, it could cause discrepancies in the reporting. And we've seen a lot of frustration around this in terms of how do I get that data there? Does my data layer even have this data? What kind of other attributes should I be passing along there? What is required versus actually not required? So lots of questions and confusion around just the eventing, and it requires a pretty deep understanding of how that should be implemented. The next one I wanted to highlight is sessions, right? So in Universal Analytics, really clear, we kind of talked about it with bounce rates, but in GA4, we add a little bit more complexity here. So in GA4, there's a concept of all sessions, engaged sessions, how engaged sessions impacts other metrics, and UA's or Universal Analytics GA3's session definition. It kind of reduces that complexity, whereas GA4 makes it a little bit harder. We still see the same kind of criteria. You can base this off of transactions. You might remember that concept of an interaction versus a non-interaction hit. That kind of loosely got translated into these key events, which are set up in your GA4 admin. If those are set up incorrectly, though, maybe someone accidentally toggles something on, that can trigger multiple events. There's also this funny concept of you could have multiple engaged sessions within one session, which is a little bit complex, but we won't get into that here. Just know that the concept of events instead of page views and how those sessions are triggered and started has changed a little bit. And so we might see the count of sessions between two systems, depending on your implementation, change a little bit over time. So remembering those good old days of Google Analytics 3 and the ease of implementation. And once we kind of set it, we didn't have to think about it unless maybe switching to a new e-com platform. The next one is around the conversion metrics. So, in Universal Analytics or GA3, we had to set up specific goals to be defined as a transaction. So those conversions are tied to those predefined goals. And it kind of created this rigid structure, easy to set up, think transaction, or at the end of your goals, maybe, form submissions, things like that. But it was kind of hard to have duplicate transactions in that property or that view. And so within GA4, though, any event can be marked as a conversion. So if this isn't carefully implemented, or maybe if it's implemented in a way that's a little loose and fast with the implementation itself, we could accidentally pass something across as a conversion that we didn't mean to. And so now all of a sudden there's other metrics that can be impacted like that, such as bounce rate, such as conversion rate, add to cart, things like that. So, we don't have these predefined goals, which is great. There's a lot of flexibility around Google Analytics 4 and how you can pass over custom events, but there are those kind of key pieces and nuances that you want to consider in terms of not passing over a miscategorized event. So let's see, the next one we'll get into here is filtered views. I think you probably all remember there was ways that you could filter down your Google Analytics 3 data into a filtered view, which was also exportable, right? So you could have as many as you wanted almost within that. You could set one as your default if you were connected to Google Sheets, whether through a direct integration, Supermetrics, or maybe into a Looker Studio report. You could pull down that filtered view and isolate the data in that export in a way that was a little bit more usable. That's not really possible in Google Analytics 4. So you've got a single data stream, which you can add some filters to, but you can't apply individual filters maybe for different people onto that same data set or data stream. So the ad hoc analysis allows for, kind of deep exploration, but you really have to know what you're looking for, how to set that up. And it's a little bit harder to get down to that historical granularity that you could have done with a filtered view in Google Analytics 3. Another big one that we reminisce about all the time is just that near real-time data and reporting. So think about times of high traffic, high conversions, promotional periods. It was really nice to be able to log in and just see those numbers go up over time, knowing if you needed to pivot at any point during the day, given those periods. We lost that in Google Analytics 4. That data is up to 24, maybe even sometimes more hours behind. So again, we don't have those instant insights. You can't refresh the data throughout the day and see those metrics start to populate as the day goes on, which kind of removes that ability for immediate action, right? So this is not something you're necessarily going to do every single day, but during high traffic, high performance periods, that is something you might want to do. And again, with the intuitive layout, there's just a couple pieces missing here on how you can navigate, slice and dice the data, get down to that granular level of information that you can action off of in Google Analytics 4. So, we definitely missed those days of being able to get to that near real-time reporting offered in GA3 and take action on it pretty immediately. Next, look at the GA4 limitations. So, just to highlight these, we don't get that same level of detail, the limited context. And as we hear over and over and over again, the UI is just not ideal. We kind of miss those days of being able to see your time series. I mean, if you're like me, being able to go into the traffic channels report and then you see all your channels split out there, right? Email, paid, organic, direct, SMS. You've got your e-commerce toggle. You can look at sessions, conversion rate, average order value, per session value, all in one view. It updates throughout the day. And, we really missed that, that piece of it. The next piece here is around around the new channel classification, right? So with the new channels, we have the introduction of kind of organic shopping, organic social. We've got the cross-platform channels, things like that. Here's a couple of examples that we might see that might have been added into your account. But when we start to look at this across the two different platforms, if you're trying to aggregate this data, you don't really have a good way to match that up if you're just exporting it out of GA3 and GA4 and then trying to synthesize it into one data set, maybe with like a Looker Studio. You'll have that break, right? So you'll have that organic social, or maybe you'll have cross-channel or cross-network as a new one. And so channels and data flowing from one to the other. Maybe you didn't set up the appropriate channel definition for your business. And so all of a sudden something that was going into email or SMS is now being classified as other or paid or something that you didn't intend. And there's no way to fix that data retroactively, right? So if you push that data into GA3, if you're putting machine learning models on top of that for predictive analytics, there's no consistency there. So as we start to look at that data together and over time, we have these breaks that make it really hard for period over period, year over year, and historical analysis. So the increased granularity is great. We can drill down as much as we want to, but it makes it really hard for comparisons. And then we have this concept of data thresholds that we didn't really see before. So data thresholds are limits applied to certain reports. In GA4, you kind of have to know what those are. We won't go into deep detail here. But also knowing when do they apply, right? So if you've got low data volume, so if reports contain a low number of users or events, GA4 might apply those thresholds, resulting in aggregated data instead of specific metrics. Custom dimensions and metrics, so if you've got custom metrics and definitions that you've applied to your account, you may see these throttled and thresholds being maybe enforced to kind of maintain the anonymity of that GA4 is pushing for in this new platform. the impacts on reporting or on data aggregation. So you might notice that certain metrics are aggregated or not displayed at all if the thresholds are applied. And then if it's inconsistent, right? So we see that reports, they kind of show these variations in the data and availability. So if it could lead to some confusion when you're comparing metrics over time if the data is being, if a data has a threshold applied to it. So, what we can see here is you need to segment like the larger groups to minimize the impact of those thresholds, and to really understand the limitations, just be hyper aware of where these thresholds are typically applied. And one of the last topics we wanted to cover is discrepancies in data and analysis. So, whether we're looking at the real-time versus the process data in GA4 in the UI may not always reflect that real-time activity. We mentioned that before. And then there's sampling. So certain reports may be subject to sampling. It's less of an issue in GA4 as we saw in GA3, but it can still impact the data in the UI. Around API data, though, when you use the GA4 API, so if you're using this in the third party, you're pulling it directly, there may be latency in data updates. And by that, I just mean the data that you pull out via the API may not always be behind, may not always match the UI. So there's already a delay in the UI. We have seen instances where that's greater when pulling via the API. And then with the API itself, we see requests getting configured with specific dimensions and metrics that might not align exactly or perfectly with the default reports in the GA4 UI. Something like that could be maybe the default channel grouping versus the session default channel grouping. So you really have to know the nuances of those fields as you start to pull the data down. And then we've seen this a lot too, data transformation, right? So if you connect GA4 to Looker Studio directly or maybe through another source, the discrepancies can come up where there's differences in the data transformation process, and that could alter the results of your analysis in Looker Studio. And then lastly, just issues around field mappings. So we've seen that come up again and again as well. This is all to say, we do miss those days of GA3. There maybe are some benefits to GA4 that might come up over time with levels of granularity, being able to pass maybe a customer ID to identify new and returning, but it's still built around anonymous data. And so some ways that you can think about this, right, is we talked about, or we have heard this kind of more simple, we call it here at Tadpole the golden equation of e-commerce, which is sessions times conversion rate times average order value equals revenue, right? You've got three kind of macro levers that you're going to be pulling at any given time. That's increased sessions, drives more revenue. Increase conversion rate, increase revenue. Increase average order value, increase revenue. You can focus on one, you can kind of let another one maybe slide. So if you see a greater increase in sessions, you don't need as high of a conversion rate in order to generate revenue, or as high of an average order value, because you're getting more, maintaining your conversion rate, so you can drive that revenue. But there's a piece missing here, right? That is a level deeper that we like to just make sure we look at here at Tadpole and work with our clients on. And we've heard other people say the same. And that's kind of a customer golden equation. So customers, the count of your customers times average order value times frequency. So think about that kind of as your sessions times conversion rate. So sessions as customers, frequency is your conversion rate. And then obviously we have average order value again. That also rolls up into revenue. But one word of caution here is we do need to look at this on a new and returning customer basis. We can't look at these as just these macro metrics. So we like to split this into new and returning customers. You've got new customers, any customer defined by just a period in time, right? We call it a month, you could call it a week, you could call it a year, a quarter, a half year. Anyone whose first order came through in that time period is a new customer. Now, depending on your business, we can talk about the nuances of exchanges and returns. Let's just put that aside for now. Let's just look at customers and how many times they order. So depending on your catalog, you might have customers that come in, make an order, they love your product, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months later, they're back making a second purchase. Maybe you got them in on a shirt, they're coming back for pants. Maybe you got them in on a pair of shoes and they're coming back for socks, or some shoe polish or leather for hiking boots, something like that, right? That's going to impact your frequency. And then the mix of your catalog is impacting your average order value. So some of these things you can start to kind of tease out in GA3 and 4, but really you might need another system to do this. And then looking at returning customers, right? So we're not even going to talk about users, new and returning users. This is strictly coming out of your e-com platform, your ERP, your order management system, right? So any returning customers are people who came to your website, made a purchase prior to that start date of your analysis. And we can see any of these levers increasing that that revenue by group, right? So maybe the average order value is the same across these two groups, but your numbers, your counts of customers, and then your frequency might be these different levels that are impacting the amount of revenue. So looking at one example here, right, we can see revenue is roughly the same, average order value is roughly the same, but it takes far fewer customers out of your returning customers to drive basically the same amount of value because of the increased frequency. So this is where we can see this 46% higher revenue per customer out of that returning customer group. So really understanding your customers. These are deeper insights that you're not going to get out of Google Analytics at all, because you're not able to push in zero-party data, and you're kind of limited on the first-party data in terms of who you can tie it to, since it is all anonymous. There were probably ways in the past of passing details in. Google really doesn't like that, though, and so you can export your data. You can look at transaction IDs. You can do a lot of matching back. That gets pretty hard, and that's not really the purpose of Google Analytics 4 or 3 for that matter. And so if we look at kind of a holistic customer, right? How many orders are they placing? Which products are they purchasing? Are they coming back by certain channels, certain devices? What kind of discounts are they applying? What kind of data are you gathering about this customer, whether it's post-purchase surveys, NPS, kind of self-reported attribution, preferences, think maybe your ESP. All of these data points kind of coming together to build out a more holistic customer profile. And there's a lot of platforms out there that can do this, right? You can aggregate this kind of information maybe in Klaviyo. Shopify has obviously data on your customers and what they're purchasing. Is it their first purchase or not? Maybe where they're coming from. Loyalty platforms. Platforms maybe like Mixpanel. Platforms like ours, The Pond. So we can get this data from a zero and first party context, from those e-com platforms. We can aggregate this data, surface it, and make it maybe just a level more usable that we weren't seeing at a GA4 or 3. And so if you're already frustrated with Google Analytics 4, maybe it's time to just look at that as, it's a mechanism to push some data into your advertising platforms, primarily Google Ads and maybe YouTube, and just kind of accepting the fact that for that deeper analysis, we're probably going to have to go elsewhere. And so it's been, in a lot of ways, maybe a nice forcing function to move on to the next thing. So in summary, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for remembering all of the great times about Google Analytics 3, the great reports we built, custom analyses, exports, pushes into Looker Studio, early mornings, late nights gathering data, and hopefully we can kind of move to the next and best thing now and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, for your comforting words and analysis in this difficult time. For anyone who wishes to mourn further with us or do a deeper dive on ways to move on with your own personal data stories, feel free to drop us a line at tadpole.com. Otherwise, stay tuned for additional opportunities to connect through our e-commerce community and share stories and solve problems together with other e-commerce experts. Thank you for your time. We will thrive together through this new analytics landscape.